From the 1950s until present, a Canadian family has owned this very isolated cabin in the middle of the Ontario backcountry. It was the only property on this very small lake. There was two others across the lake, but they were pretty far away. And with the exception of the side of the cabin that was facing the water, the rest of it was surrounded by really dense forest that went on for quite a while. About 2 miles away from this cabin, on the other side of this dirt road, was this huge wildlife reserve that was pretty much just a huge forest that was protected. And anytime the family was visiting this cabin, the kids would at some point go into the reserve and go explore. In 2001, when the family was at the cabin, the kids were across the road over at the reserve, and they decided to walk down this particular trail that they hadn't seen before, and they just started walking. And for about 30 minutes, they're seeing new areas they hadn't seen before, and then they come to this clearing, and there's all these abandoned houses. At first, there was a little debate about whether these were actually abandoned because they did look like they were in pretty good condition. But when they walked a little bit closer, it became very clear that nature is reclaiming this land. Grass is up to your waist. There's vines growing up the side of the houses. There were cars still parked in driveways that were totally rusted out, and grass is growing all through them. And so they knew these were abandoned. They walked up to the first house they saw, and they looked in, and they couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was like whoever lived here had left without taking anything. The house was still totally furnished. In fact, their dining room table still had plates and cups and forks and knives, like they had just had dinner and then just got up and left. They start talking about going into these houses and looking around inside, but they started wondering, is this a museum? Is that why everything is in such good repair? Should we not go inside these houses? And they start looking around for any indication that definitely this is not a museum, these are just plain abandoned. And across the street from the house they were at was this totally decrepit looking house. Let's go over there and look in there. And so they look in a window, and very clearly the ceiling is totally sagging down. And the first floor is buckling completely, and there's clothes and shoes scattered everywhere. And so for them, this was confirmation that this is no museum. These are abandoned. We can totally go look around inside. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids explored all the houses that looked structurally sound, that weren't going to collapse on them. And it was just fascinating. There was all this stuff that was left behind that was fairly valuable. And they didn't take anything. They just thought it was very cool. And after a while, they decided they had seen enough, and they turned around and headed back to their cabin. After they got back, they told their parents about what they found. And their father was like, man, that sounds awesome. I want to go check that out. And so that day, they went right back over to the abandoned houses. The first house they showed him was the really decrepit looking one where the ceiling was sagging and there was women's shoes and clothes all over the ground, to show him for sure these are abandoned, because we had some doubts at first too. These are definitely abandoned. So they look at that house, and then they went back to the very first house they saw when they walked into this complex, the one that was in great condition and had the dining table still set. So they go inside and they go upstairs, and they find this bedroom that, like everything else in the house, is totally intact. You got pictures on the wall, it's fully furnished. There's even still sheets made on the bed. In the pillow, it's got a head imprint from whoever was there last. And at the foot of the bed is this beautiful fur coat. And the father walks over to it and he looks at it and he's like, this is real fur. This is a really expensive coat. I want to take this for our family. But before he took it, he had a hesitation. Is this really abandoned? If someone had been here, they would have seen footprints all over the house just because there's grime all over the ground, and they can clearly see their footprints from where they've just come in. And he's like, no, this is just a weird situation. It's definitely abandoned, and finders keepers. And so he picks up the jacket and he says, I'm going to give this to mom after I clean it up. And so with the jacket in hand, the father and the kids explore the rest of the house. And when they go outside, they realize it's starting to get late and it's probably time to head back. And so they turn around and they start walking away from these houses towards their cabin. And they get about 50 or 60 meters away when one of the kids said he just had this weird sense that they were being watched. And so he turns around and he's shocked when he sees there is an old woman standing in the bedroom that they had just been in, where the fur coat was. She's got a loose bun on the top of her head. She's got this blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream blouse, and she's glaring at them. When the kid saw this woman, he made an audible gasp, and the rest of the group turned around too and saw this woman in the window. And the feeling was guilt. They're like, oh my goodness, we just stole from this poor woman who lives in this abandoned house. And so right away, the whole group starts walking right back towards the house. They're going to give this jacket back. In fact, the dad is like, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have taken this. I'm sorry. And as they're walking back towards the property, the woman in the window who hasn't said anything just turns around and walks back into the main part of the house. They can't see her anymore. And so as they're walking closer to the house, they're assuming she's going to come downstairs to retrieve this jacket that they've taken from her. And so they get right up to the front door, and the father is yelling to her, "I'm sorry, where do you want me to leave this jacket? I can bring it in to you." And they're kind of just waiting for her to come downstairs. And she doesn't. She's nowhere to be found. She's not making any sound. She's not indicating what to do. And so after waiting for a couple of minutes, the kids don't really know what to do, and they're kind of getting uneasy about the situation. And the father is still very confident that he just wants to give this back and make amends, make peace with her, say he's sorry. And so he walks inside. He tells his kids, "Stay here. I'm going to go give it to her." And he goes inside and he disappears upstairs. And then all of a sudden, from across the street in that decrepit house with the caved in ceiling, they hear one of the second floor windows come slamming down. And at the same time, their dad comes charging down the stairs, no jacket with him, and he's saying, "Go, go, go." And the kids are spooked from the window getting slammed, and they start running away until they're about 100 meters away from these houses. And they stop and they're panting and they're out of breath. And the kids ask their dad, "What happened?" And he says to them, "I looked everywhere upstairs and I could not find that lady. I don't know where she is. Either she's hiding from us or something, but I happened to be looking out at that other house. Something caught my eye. There was movement, and I saw another person in the second floor of that building that's falling apart. And I watched them slam the window, and then as soon as I did, I heard someone yell, 'Get out!' and I ran out after you guys." Now, the kids and the dad are absolutely terrified, and they want to leave, but they also want one more look at these buildings before they do. And when they had run away, they had stopped behind this big group of trees that obscured their view to the buildings. They were out of sight. And so they begin to peek their heads around the tree until they can see the building, and they can't believe what they see. Standing in the window of the fur coat room is not only the old woman, but also a very tall man who's holding her shoulders and is bending down because his head is too high to look standing. He's crouched down and he's looking out the window next to her, and they're both glaring towards them. The father and his kids are practically falling over themselves to sprint away and back to their cabin. To this day, that family has no idea who those people were, what they were doing there, how they were able to move around without making any noise and consistently hide from them and not leave any footprints. It was all very strange and terrifying stuff. And then the government ended up demolishing those houses almost immediately after they were there. And so they'll never get any answers because everything's gone. 2003, Kevin Mannis owned an antique shop right in downtown Portland at the base of the Burnside Bridge, which is considered the gateway to the city. Because Kevin owned this antique shop, he was always at yard sales and estate sales looking to find the next thing he could sell at his shop. And so one day there was this estate sale over at this woman's house. She had just passed away. She was about 103 years old. She was a Holocaust survivor, and her estate was being sold. And so he goes over to the house and he sees the way they're selling all of her items is by bundling them in different lots. So depending on what item it was, they'd be bundled with similar items and then sold as a package. So the people there would be bidding on the whole lot. They couldn't buy individual items. And Kevin had his eye on one particular lot called Lot 29, and Lot 29 included a couple of small tools that he wanted to sell in his shop, and it had this mystery box, and that's exactly as it was labeled. It just says mystery box on it, and he was intrigued by it. And so he placed a bid on Lot 29, and ultimately he won the bid, and he was really happy about it. So he takes the contents of Lot 29 and he wheels them over to his car, and as he's loading stuff into the back of his car, someone behind him says, "Oh, so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" And Kevin in his head went right back to his childhood, because growing up, he had always been scared of Dybbuks, because a Dybbuk is a malevolent spirit in Jewish folklore, and Kevin was Jewish, and so his parents used to say, "Oh, you better not do that, Kevin, or the Dybbuk's gonna get you." And so he grew up terrified of Dybbuks, and so his interest is piqued. And Kevin turns around and he says, "Did you just call this box a Dybbuk box?" And the woman's like, "Yeah, and my grandmother was terrified of it, and she said no one could ever open it." And Kevin turns to look at the box, and it's about 2 foot high by 1 foot wide, and there are these little doors that swing open on the front, and then on the bottom there's a drawer that comes out, and there's one lock that sits across the 2 doors, and it's currently locked with a little padlock. And he looks up at her and he goes, "Why can't you open it?" And the woman just says, "We never knew, but our grandmother would always go every time we said the word Dybbuk, and so it was weird enough that we just never asked any questions and we stayed away from her Dybbuk box." Kevin agreed that was pretty weird, and he finished loading his car, shut the trunk, said bye to the woman, hopped in his car, and he drove away. And he never really gave it a second thought. At this point, he's not thinking the Dybbuk box is anything malevolent. He thinks it's just some random chest that he won at an auction. Kevin drives back to his antique shop and he begins unloading all the things he won at the auction. He brings them inside and he brings them downstairs because the top floor, the main floor, was really where he sold things. When he got new items, he would bring them downstairs to his warehouse of sorts, which was much bigger than the first floor, had lots of rows of shelving, and it had a workstation down there. He would bring his new things down there and he would price them and get them ready before bringing them back up. And at some point, he brought the Dybbuk box in and he brought it down and he put it on the back table. He was about to just leave it there and go back upstairs when suddenly he became really curious and he really wanted to open the Dybbuk box. And so he goes over and he kind of yanks on the front two doors. He doesn't want to damage it, but he can tell this lock is relatively new and it's not just going to come off. And so he doesn't have the key to it and he doesn't have a way to clip the lock. And so he takes a screwdriver and he basically wedges it underneath the actual metal clasps that are attached to the wood. And he slowly kind of bends it up and bends it off and pops it out of the wood. And as soon as he does that, the doors swing open and there's like a mechanical device inside of the Dybbuk box that activates the drawer. Basically, anytime the doors open, the drawer also opens at the same time. And Kevin remembered thinking how silly it was that this kind of old, crummy looking wine closet had this fairly complicated mechanism inside of it that still worked. Inside the Dybbuk box were 2 pennies from the 1920s. There was a used candle. There were 2 locks of hair. There was this small tombstone that said Shalom on it. And there was also a small wine goblet that was inside. And that was it. And Kevin immediately thought, well, this is just some older woman's keepsake. And these things maybe have sentimental value to her, but they don't to me. And so he shut the Dybbuk box, pushed it to the side of the desk, and walked upstairs and didn't give it another thought. Kevin had one employee at the antique shop. Her name was Jane. She was a younger woman. She was an incredible saleswoman. And Kevin thought very highly of her. And so the day after he had brought the Dybbuk box into the antique shop and put it downstairs on the desk, he needed to run out and do some errands, and so he put Jane in charge of the store. And so Kevin leaves, and Jane locks the front door to the shop behind Kevin because she needed to go downstairs and get a few items that she wanted to bring upstairs to sell that day, and it was before opening time. So front door's locked, no one else is inside the shop, and Jane goes down into the basement. Once you went down the wooden steps into the basement, you'd be looking out at this huge room of all these industrial shelves that run the length of the room where they would keep their antiques and other valuables on. And the lighting down there was never that great because they used these long fluorescent tube lights that at best cast a kind of subtle yellow glow on everything. They were not particularly bright, and it was a real pain to actually go up and change them because you needed to place a ladder, but the ladders were not perfectly aligned with the lights. You basically had to reach over the shelving where all the antiques were, and you ran the risk of knocking things over. And so a lot of times Jane and Kevin would wait until you were down to like 1 or 2 crappy working lights before they'd say, okay, we really got to go up there and replace some of these bulbs. And so as it happens, this day, they're down to like 2 or 3 working lights. So in classic horror movie fashion, she's going into this dingy basement with very poor lighting. And so once she gets to the bottom of the steps, she walks to the far end of the room, a little bit away from where the Dybbuk box was placed on that back table. She's in the other corner in the back of this basement, and she's getting some things off the shelf when all of a sudden she stops. And she can't help but shake the feeling that she feels like someone is watching her. Now, she is down in this basement all the time, whether it's well lit or dark, whether Kevin is there with her or she's alone. This is a place she goes all the time, and she's never had this feeling before. There's no way to get into the basement unless you come down the stairs, and she locked the front door, and she was the only one who came downstairs. She hasn't heard anything. There's no other way to leave this space. So she doesn't know where she's getting this feeling from, but she really can't shake it. And as she's kind of looking around and she's starting to get a little bit paranoid, the phone rings. They had a landline that was on a table right at the base of the stairs. The phone rings down there and it startles her. And then it kind of jumps her back into reality. And she's like, okay, I'm getting paranoid. And she walks over and she picks up the phone, and it's actually her friend who was planning on coming by the antique shop that day. So as they're chatting, Jane hears what sounds like a broom. Imagine if a push broom is lined up against the wall and then it falls over, the sound that the wooden stick would make as it hits concrete. That's the sound she hears as she's on the phone. And it startles her again, and she goes, hey, let me call you back. She hangs up on her friend and she's looking out, And because the lighting is terrible from where she is, she's now at the foot of the stairs looking down all these rows, and she's heard that stick land on the ground on the far side back where she had been originally. She's kind of looking around and she can't see anything. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the rows to see what fell over. And as she's walking down the row, something smashes behind her and she turns around and one of the fluorescent tube lights has fallen from the ceiling and smashed onto the ground. And so all of a sudden she doesn't want to explore this falling broom that's behind her in the dark corner of the basement. Instead, she's ready to leave. And so she starts walking back towards the stairs to get out of here. And as she's walking down one of these rows, a wooden chair that is on one of the shelves comes flying off of it and lands squarely in the middle, blocking her path. And there's no way this could have happened unless someone pushed this chair. And suddenly she thinks, someone's down here with me. And she screams and she hurdles the chair and she runs to the steps. She starts running up. And to her horror, there is a metal door that locks the basement at night. So if someone were to break in, it's another layer to protect the store from thieves. And it was shut and locked. It can only be locked from the outside and with a key. So there's no way she would have done this by accident. And now she's freaking out because she's trapped in the basement with some person running around, pushing chairs over and breaking lights. And so she grabs the gate and she starts shaking it and she's yelling for Kevin, thinking maybe he came in and forgot I was down here and shut and locked the gate. And she's checking over her shoulder, looking down into the basement, and she starts hearing more lights falling off the ceiling and shattering on the ground. She is in absolute panic mode. She's just waiting for someone to come bounding up the stairs towards her. She has no idea what to do. She pulls out her phone and she calls Kevin. Meanwhile, Kevin is making his way back to the antique shop. He's only a couple minutes away and he sees his phone ringing that was sitting on the passenger seat, and he picks it up and it's Jane, and he answers, and immediately Jane is hysterical and she's screaming that someone's in the antique shop that's breaking things. And Kevin's like, slow down, what's going on? And all he can hear in the background is the sound of what sounds like glass shattering and things falling and breaking. And he's like, wait, what's going on? Are you okay, Jane? Like, where are you? And he hears her say, someone's in the basement. And he goes, well, where are you? And she's like, I'm in the basement. And he was like, get out of the basement, call the police. But as he's trying to get her to do that, the phone cuts out. Kevin was only about a block away from his shop, so he floors it to his shop. He parks outside and he's thinking to himself, what am I walking into? Is there going to be like an active burglary going on? Is she going to be held hostage? Like, are the police going to be there? But he just knows he needs to get in there to Jane, and he gets to the front door and it's locked. So he unlocks the front door and he goes inside and it's silent. When he's looking around, there's no damage to the first floor. There's no damage anywhere. And he yells for Jane. There's no answer from Jane. And he starts walking kind of tentatively through the store towards the back. And he gets to that door leading down into the basement, the same one that Jane couldn't open when she ran up the stairs to get out of the basement. And he looks at it, and Jane's not at the top of the stairs anymore. And he's thinking, I didn't lock that door, and I'm the only one with the key to lock that door. How is it locked right now? Does Jane have a key that I don't know about? And why would she lock it? Does that mean Jane's up here somewhere? Is that what happened? And he's like, Jane, come out. Did you lock this door? But Jane's not on the first floor, and their first floor is very small. And so he thinks, okay, she has to be downstairs. And so he opens up the gate, he swings it open, and he starts walking down the steps. And he's really cautious as he's going down because, again, he has no idea what he's walking into. He hits the lights, but the lights don't work down there. And as he starts to bend around the corner where he can actually see into the basement, he sees Jane sitting at the chair right next to that table where that phone is, and she's just sitting there kind of stunned. And he goes to Jane and he's like, what happened down here? And he glances out quickly at all the rows and he sees all this furniture that's come off the shelves, and there's glass all over the ground. And he's looking at Jane, and Jane's just showing no reaction. She's sitting there like she's in shock. And he turns to Jane again and he says, come on, you got to tell me what happened down here. And Jane just goes, I don't know. I don't know how to explain what happened down here. I was walking down the row, and then I felt like someone was watching me, and then things are falling off the ceiling and the shelves. I've never seen anything like this before. Now, at this point, Kevin's adrenaline is through the roof. He came charging in here thinking he was going to have to save Jane from some person breaking in and breaking stuff. But as far as he can tell, there's no one here but Jane. And so he decides he's going to take a flashlight and he's going to explore the basement, because Either there's someone here or Jane did this. So he grabs his flashlight and he starts walking around, and all he sees is a bunch of broken glass and some furniture that's come off the shelves and a couple other things that are on the ground. But other than that, there's no one down here, and there's no other way to come in or out of here besides the stairs. So after Kevin is certain that no one else is here, he turns to Jane, and he regrets this now. He says in an interview that he feels horrible about this now, but at the time, he's thinking to himself, you know, this had to have been Jane. Who else would have done this? I don't know why she did this, but there's no one else here. And he goes, Jane, did you do this? And this is when Jane's emotions came through, because before she was in shock, now she's mad. And she goes, F you, Kevin. And she leaves. And she doesn't say another word to him, and she doesn't come back. She quits on the spot. But at the time, Kevin believed she had done it. So he was kind of like, oh well. He was not even a little bit thinking the Dybbuk box had anything to do with this. Just a couple of days after the basement incident, Kevin's mother was supposed to come by the antique shop, and the two of them were going to leave and get lunch together to celebrate her birthday. As soon as she walked into the shop, Kevin goes, hey mom, I got a gift for you. And he brings over this wrapped box, and he sets it down on a table right in front of his mother, who's sitting on a chair. And he unwraps it, and it's the Dybbuk box. Before Kevin can explain what it is, the phone rings at the other end of the store, and he was expecting a call, and he goes, hold on mom, I gotta get this. And he goes to the back of the store to answer the call while his mom is just sitting there looking at the box. And so while Kevin is at the other end of the store, his mother opens the Dybbuk box, and she says she had to sit down as soon as she opened it because she had this unbelievable, overwhelming sense of dread as soon as the doors were open. And she's staring at it like she can't take her eyes away, and then all of a sudden she has a massive stroke. And so she keels over, and she can't move, and she can't talk. And Kevin sees this happening. He runs over, and he's like, Mom, what's going on? He calls 911. And as the paramedics are working on her, she would say that while she was in this kind of paralyzed state, when she couldn't talk and she couldn't move, all she wanted to communicate was to somehow get her son to get rid of that box. She didn't know why, but she felt like the box had something to do with her having the stroke. And so all she could do was move her eyes. And so she found herself, because her son's right here, looking at the Dybbuk box and looking away, looking at the Dybbuk box, looking away, hoping her son would see her eyes as a signal to look at the Dybbuk box and put it together that that thing's bad. And Kevin does realize that his mom is flicking her eyes at the Dybbuk box, but in the moment, he's much more concerned about the health of his mother. And it wasn't until she got put in a hospital and she was being taken care of and he knew she'd be okay, then he remembers, he kind of went over it in his head later that day, that his mom was really scared looking, and she was looking at the Dybbuk box like that was the thing that was causing her to be scared. Not the stroke, the Dybbuk box. And Kevin starts thinking to himself, I don't know, there's something off about the Dybbuk box. Either it's really bad luck, or there's some truth to you don't open up this Dybbuk box. Either way, I don't want to take any more chances, because so long as I've owned this thing, I've had a horrible thing happen in the basement, and now my mom's had a stroke. So I want to get rid of it. So Kevin puts the Dybbuk box at the front of his antique store, and he puts it up for sale. And very quickly, a young couple came into the store, and they bought the Dybbuk box. And Kevin's relieved. He's like, thank goodness that bad luck charm, that whatever's going on with that thing is gone and out of my life. But just a couple of days later, he was in the back of the shop when he heard the door open, and then the door shut. And he walked out expecting to see some customers, but instead he sees the Dybbuk box that's sitting right inside his store. Someone must have just dropped it off. And so he walks up to it and he sees there's a piece of paper that's been taped to the top of the Dybbuk box, and there's writing on it. And all it says is, this has an odd darkness about it. This really freaked Kevin out, because in a way, it was like other people were confirming that something was wrong with this box. Kevin did not want the Dybbuk box to be in his store, so he put it in his car and he drove back to his house and he put it in his storage locker and he locked it up and then went back to work for the day. That night when he went home, he went to bed and he had this dream. Where in the dream, he's walking in this courtyard and he's holding the hand of this woman who he believes is his friend, and he trusts this person, and the area he's in feels very friendly, and it's a very positive dream. And as he's walking, all of a sudden, this person starts to pull away from him, and he can't move anymore, and he's losing the grip on this person's hand. And they keep moving and moving until their hand is out of his, and they disappear into the corner of the courtyard where it's totally dark. And so he's looking into the darkness, waiting for his friend to come out again, and he he can't move. He's anchored to the spot, and as he's looking, he sees what looks like an old woman walking out of the mist, and her head is down, and he can't tell what she's doing, and she's pretty far away, and she's walking closer and closer to him, and when she's about 5-6 feet away, she raises her head up, and her whole face is falling off. All the skin is falling off of her face. It's rotting. She's like a corpse, and she raises her hands up in front of her, and then she grabs his face and begins pulling off pieces of his face until he suddenly wakes up. Kevin had to compose himself in bed because he was so scared from the dream he just had. He sits up and he goes into the bathroom to get a sip of water, and as he walks past the mirror, he notices there are marks on his shoulders and his arms that he did not have before. It looks like bruising almost. And he's looking at them and he's thinking, no way. That has nothing to do with the dream. This is just coincidence that, she was grabbing me in this area in the dream and now I have marks there. It's just coincidence. And so he kind of writes it off and he goes back to bed. And he has the same dream. He gets up again and he's breathing heavily. He's sweating because he just had the same dream. It was this terrifying dream. And he goes back into the bathroom and now his entire back is covered in bruises. He has bruises all over his back, all over his arms. He's got red marks on his neck. And now in his mind, he feels like it has to do with the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is now in my backyard. It's not a coincidence that all of a sudden I'm having these horrific dreams that are apparently manifesting themselves in bruises and marks on my actual body. And so Kevin is done with the Dybbuk box, and instead of going back to bed, he goes to his computer and he puts the Dybbuk box on eBay up for sale. And that night, 2 college kids named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, they buy the Dybbuk box, and Kevin could not be happier to package that thing up and ship it off. Sam and Brian had seen the ad on eBay for the Dybbuk box, and at first it did not seem remarkable, but they saw that Kevin had given this really detailed description of all the strange things that had happened for him since he owned the Dybbuk box. And I think clearly Kevin's angle was he was almost trying to advertise it to groups of people that might be interested in that. And Sam and Brian were exactly that demographic because they were looking for things online that were considered haunted. They wanted to see if ghosts and the paranormal were real. And so they were eager to buy the Dybbuk box and test it out. And so 3 weeks later, when this package finally arrives in Missouri at their house, Brian was still out at class, but Sam was home, so he receives the package. He eagerly brings it into the kitchen, he unpackages it, and he sets it on the kitchen table. And just a few minutes later, Brian comes home, and Brian would say in interviews that when he walked in, it smelled like someone had peed all over the apartment, like there was urine everywhere. And he's walking around thinking, what happened? This smells so bad in here. And he walks into the kitchen where it was the strongest smell, and there's Sam proudly standing next to this awful looking chest, which was of course the Dybbuk box. And he realizes, Brian does, that the Dybbuk box is what smells like urine. And he goes, Sam, do you smell that? And Sam's like, yeah, that's the smell of ghosts. Sam would pick it up and go, ooh, to Brian as soon as he walked into the kitchen. And Sam joked about how he couldn't wait to sleep in the same bed as the Dybbuk box. They were just making a big joke out of it. Sam had also set up a blog where he was going to document everything that happened from day one of receiving this Dybbuk box to whenever they got rid of it or till whenever something happened. And for the first 2 weeks they had the Dybbuk box in their possession, nothing did happen. But when Sam started bringing the Dybbuk box out and leaving it right in the middle of these huge parties they would throw where people were spilling beer on it and they were opening it up and putting things inside of it and making jokes with it, when they were doing that to the Dybbuk box, suddenly they started seeing a pretty significant uptick in strangeness inside of their house. It started with their technology. Sam's laptop crashed and the hard drive was unrecoverable, so he had to replace his laptop. All of their watches just didn't work while they were in the house. No matter what they did, no matter when they fixed it, the watch just simply did not work. Their Xbox would not turn on, but when they brought it to another person's house, it worked just fine. It just couldn't work inside of their house. And the toaster, anytime you turned it on, it basically immediately incinerated whatever you put inside of it. But none of these technological difficulties were frightening to Sam or Brian. They were just frustrating. And I don't even think they were connecting them with the Dybbuk box. It was just this thing that was happening to them. It wasn't until the light bulbs in their house started bursting in the middle of the night that they started to get pretty creeped out about some of the things that were happening in their apartment. That now all of a sudden it did seem like, maybe if the Dybbuk box really is cursed, this might be how it would manifest. And so they'd replace the light bulb and then sure enough it would burst again. And they couldn't keep light bulbs in because they kept popping. And so their house was dark a lot of the time. But the worst part was when they had this massive insect infestation inside of their apartment. And they were really localized around the Dybbuk box. All these insects would come out of the walls, out of the toilets, out of the sink. They'd come from behind the fridge, and they would all kind of like converge on the Dybbuk box and go inside of it. The Dybbuk box at one point was swarming with insects all over, and they had to shut the door. They couldn't even go in the room with the Dybbuk box because it was just covered in insects. But despite how scary this was for the boys, they had become kind of like a cool talking point on campus because of Sam's blog that a lot of other students were following. And so the boys kind of liked the clout they got with that, and they decided they didn't want to get rid of the box after all. But it wasn't long after the insect infestation that Sam began losing all of his hair, and at the same time, he started having this constant hallucination that there was an old woman in his peripheral vision on either side of his head pretty much at all times. Anywhere he went, there basically was someone he couldn't quite see following him around. Whether he was well rested, whether he was totally exhausted, it didn't matter. He always saw this shrouded dark figure that he believed was an old woman, and it scared him so much he couldn't sleep, and so he began going into Brian's room and sitting on Brian's bed because it was the one place he felt a little bit of comfort. And as he's sitting on the bed, he would see these dark figures standing on either side of him all night. And so finally, no matter how cool their blog was, it became too much, and they decide we have to get rid of the Dybbuk box. And so they put it on eBay, and very quickly it gets sold to a guy named Jason, who is this museum director over at this other university in Missouri, and he had actually been following along with Sam's blog. He was very interested in what was going on with the Dybbuk box, and when it was listed for sale, he was all over it. He wanted to buy it. So the boys eagerly ship off the Dybbuk box, and Jason receives it in the middle of a workday, so he puts the package in his truck and he goes upstairs and he works for the day, and then afterwards, when everyone's left the office, he goes downstairs, gets the package, brings it back up to his office, puts it on his desk, and he cuts open the packaging. Jason decided he wanted to evaluate the Dybbuk box the way he would evaluate any other antique or item that was coming into the museum that he was the director of. And so Jason starts by taking a whole bunch of pictures all around the outside of the Dybbuk box, and then he gets his blacklight out and he begins scanning around the outside, and he finds all these traces of wax all over the outside, which leads him to believe this was probably used in some sort of ritual. And then he takes a deep breath and he sits down right in front of the Dybbuk box, and he pops off the lock, and he gets ready, and he opens the doors, and the drawer slides out with that whole mechanical device. It all kind of comes open, and Jason's totally let down because nothing happens. And part of him thought, like, if this thing is haunted, as soon as you open it up, the haunting's going to begin. And nothing happened. And he's pretty let down about it. And so ultimately, after staring at it and looking at the pennies that are in there and the Shalom statue and the locks of hair, he's just kind of let down by it, and he decides, okay, I kind of got my hopes up for something. This was clearly a hoax. There's nothing going on here. It's just a random old chest. And so he closes it up and he puts it on another desk that wasn't the one that he worked at, but was just kind of another table inside of this office that he shared with some other people. And he figured it would be a good talking point to tell his colleagues about, and it would be kind of like a showpiece. So the next day, his colleagues come in and he explains what a Dybbuk box is and the history around it, that it's supposed to be haunted, and, you know, it makes people sick and gives people strokes, and, you know, there's been insects that have been known to come out of it and go into it. It's this very creepy thing. And his colleagues are like, wow, that's pretty cool, but they don't think much of it until all of the electronics inside of their office start to fail. Namely, their computers start crashing, and their IT department comes up and they're like, we don't know why this is happening, but sorry, we can't recover it. And the light bulbs kept going out to the point where they went out and got this huge pack of extra light bulbs to replace the light bulbs as they went out. Something they never had to do before, but all of a sudden the Dybbuk box is in the room and the light bulbs are going out left and right. And then finally, Jason's coworkers that share that space with the Dybbuk box, they all got sick. And they blamed the Dybbuk box. They said, you know what? We were fine until that thing came in here. Now all of a sudden our computers don't work, the lights don't work, and we're getting sick. Get rid of it, Jason. So that day after work, Jason goes and takes the Dybbuk box, puts it in the back of his truck, and his truck had a cover on the back. So he secures it in the back, he drives home, and he doesn't want to bring it inside because it just seemed weird to bring a cursed object inside that his coworkers just made him get out of their space because it was making them sick and it was ruining their things. So he thinks, okay, I'll leave it in my truck overnight and I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it tomorrow. He goes inside, he says hi to his family, and before long it's time for bed and Jason goes to sleep. In order to understand what happened to Jason, you need to understand the layout of his house. When you open the front door, you walk inside and there's a wall on your right-hand side. That's the side of the house. And you walk forward about 5 or 6 feet, and on your left is a staircase that goes up to the second floor. If you walk up that staircase, straight ahead of you is going to be a bathroom. If you go left and walk down the hall another 5 or 6 feet, you come to the master suite where Jason and his wife would sleep. If you walk through that door, there is a wall on your left where there's a big bay window that looks out onto the street. And there's a big street light that sits right outside that projects very orangey yellow light into their room at night. Even though they have a shade up, it's this orange glow that comes through this window right here on this side. And then on the other side of the room is the bed. And the bed is situated where the feet are pointed towards this window over here, and the head of the bed is against this wall. And it's centered on this wall here. And Jason, if you were looking overhead at the top of this bed, Jason's on the left side, so he's the farthest into his room, and his wife is the closest into the room. So that night, Jason goes to bed and he falls asleep. But just a couple hours later, he wakes up suddenly and he can't move his body. He can only move his eyes. He's laying on his back, and the light from the street light is very strong. It's this orangey glow in their whole room. And he's laying there trying to move his hands and his legs, but he can't do it. And as he's doing that, he starts hearing footsteps out on the stairs. And they're distinctive sounds, slow, plodding steps all the way up to the second floor. And Jason's laying here with his eyes looking towards the door because his door is open and he can barely see into the second floor landing. And he's waiting to see who came up the stairs. And his heart's racing and he's looking, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees what looks like a dark figure begin to walk into the room. And his heart starts racing even faster when he can tell it's definitely not someone he knows. It's this woman, this older woman with a shawl over her head, and her head is tucked down so he can't see her. And this is all out of the corner of his eye. And because of the orange hue coming in from the window, he can definitely tell that there is a real solid figure right there. This is not in his imagination, it's right there. And this woman begins shuffling her way across the foot of the bed, and right at the foot of the bed, as Jason's looking at her, she turns and looks directly at him. And then she runs around the corner and she looks down at him and she takes her fingers and she drives them into his eyes. And Jason thinks it's real and he's screaming in pain, and he wakes up and his wife is grabbing him and she's like, Jason, what's wrong? And he's like, what's going on? And she says, honey, it's just a bad dream. You're fine. And he's shaken up. His heart's still racing from this dream he's just had. And he's trying to think, like, that felt really real. And he's like feeling his eyes. And he can't believe that that was a dream. That was the most vivid dream he's ever had in his life. And so eventually he goes back to sleep. And then the next morning when he gets up, he goes in the bathroom and he looks at his eyes, and they're all red around the outside, and the whites of his eyes are covered in blood. His eyes look horrible, like he's having this terrible allergic reaction to something, or it looks like someone might have punched him in the eyes, or maybe gouged his eyes. That's how it looks. And his wife comes in and she's like, what happened to you? And he's like, oh my God, I have no idea. It was around this time that Jason began to think the Dybbuk box might just be cursed, because the two previous owners have said in their disclosures on eBay that horrible, vivid dreams, just like the one he had, to include physical manifestations, are part of having this Dybbuk box. Jason considered just dumping this thing in a dumpster somewhere, but then he was concerned that he might be passing on this Dybbuk box to someone who wasn't ready for it. And so he decided he would give it another day and he would do some research about how to properly dispose of a Dybbuk box. And so that night when Jason came back from work, he left the Dybbuk box in his truck covered up in his driveway. And so Jason goes inside, he has dinner with his family, and then he's sitting down in the TV room and he's watching TV with his son. And as they're watching TV quietly, Jason hears his son say, hey Dad, who is that? And he looks over at his son, and his son is pointing behind him. And Jason turns around, and standing right behind him is the same woman who had come in his room with a shawl on that gouged his eyes out in his dream, and then she suddenly disappears. And Jason's looking at his son like, you just saw that too? And he's like, yeah, who was that? And so Jason grabs his son, he yells for his wife and says, we have to leave the house right now. His wife comes downstairs and she's like, what's going on? And he was like, I will explain in the car, and we have to take your car. And so his wife sees how serious Jason is, and she says, okay. And they get into her car and they drive down the road. And that's when Jason explains what's going on with the Dybbuk box and how he and his son just saw the same woman that he had seen in his dream the night before that gouged his eyes, and his eyes were red, and his wife's starting to get really scared. scared and his son's really scared of what's going on. And so the solution they came up with was they were going to drive back to their house, drop Jason off, who was going to get in his truck where the Dybbuk box is still in the back. It's still locked in the back of the truck. And he's going to drive it a few miles outside of town to a rental property they owned that no one was staying in. And he was going to put it in the basement. And it was going to stay there until they figured out how to dispose of it. Because they didn't like the idea of just dumping it somewhere, because they felt like if this is real and it's actually this cursed Dybbuk box, then somebody else is going to be cursed by this Dybbuk box unless we find a way, or at least attempt to find a way to contain it and destroy it. And so Jason gets dropped off, he gets in his truck, he drives to the rental property, he puts it in the basement, he seals it up, and he goes back to his house. Once Jason got back to his house, his wife and his son came back as well. And that night, Jason would go on eBay and he would find the contact information for Kevin, the original owner of the Dybbuk box, after the estate sale. And he called him that night, and Kevin actually picked up, and the two of them spoke, and Kevin ultimately agrees to help Jason find a way to properly dispose of this Dybbuk box. And what Kevin offers to do is drive back to the house where he had originally purchased this Dybbuk box and see if he can get some more information about what it is and what they do with it. The next day, Kevin, the antique shop owner, he goes back to the house where he originally bought the Dybbuk box at the estate sale. He knocks on the door, and an old woman comes to the door, and Kevin introduces himself, and he says, hey, I was here not too long ago, and I purchased lot 29 that included that Dybbuk box, and I wanted to know some more information about it. And the woman reacted, and she's like, I told my family not to sell that. I know what was inside of it, and I know you're not supposed to open it, and I tried to tell my family, and they didn't listen. I really hope you didn't open it. And Kevin's like, actually, yeah, I did open it. And he described all the horrible things that happened, and he described selling it and all the subsequent owners, how they've had all these issues, and how they've arrived at this place now where Jason in Missouri is having all these issues, and they're trying to find a way to dispose of it. And that's when Sophie describes what's actually inside of this box. Sophie said she lived in Poland before World War II with her cousin Havila, who was the woman who had passed away, and all her things were being sold at the estate sale. And she said that at the time, it was all the rage to have seances and try to talk to dead people and spirits, and they would just do it for fun. Sophie, Havila, and their mother, they would do this for fun. And Havila had made this Ouija board where she had stitched letters onto this blanket, and they put it over this table, and they would all hold this pendant that was suspended by a chain, and they would ask questions, and they would hope that, a spirit that they were interacting with would interact with this chain, and it would swivel around the pendant, and it would point to the different letters whenever they asked a question, and it would spell out, whatever their answer was. And Sophie said nothing ever happened. It was just kind of a fun thing for them to do. But one time it did work, and they said the chain would go rigid, and it would point over and over, and it would spell the words, release me, release me, release me. Sophie said the women were incredulous and didn't believe it at first, but then they started to worry that if they didn't help this thing, that if it were a Dybbuk and were a malevolent spirit, it would find a way to attach itself to one of them. And so Sophie said they devised this ritual where they released it, but into this wine box that they were able to shut and lock. And that wine box became the Dybbuk box, and that Dybbuk box is the same one that was sold to Kevin. Kevin told Sophie that, what do we do? We've already opened it up. And she said, you need to contact a rabbi. And so they would call a rabbi, and apparently they were able to reclaim the Dybbuk inside of the box and lock it and put it away in a secret location where it's been since 2003. And apparently since it's been sealed off, Jason and Kevin have said they've experienced no demonic activity, and they never plan to tell anybody where this thing is because they don't want anyone else to have even the opportunity to reopen the Dybbuk box and have to deal with all the horrible things that they went through. There's a good reason why so many movies that are designed to be scary are set in the woods. Really, the woods at night. And if you go even further, most of them are like a cabin in the woods at night, right? It's because being in the woods at night, as human beings, checks a lot of fear boxes. You have the isolation factor. You're far away from society. That scares us. We don't want to be isolated. You feel more vulnerable that way. It checks the darkness fear factor. As humans, we're mostly afraid of the dark because you don't know what's around you or what's looking at you. You don't have the advantage of, city lights beaming in. You're kind of probably removed from lots of light pollution, so you're kind of like in total darkness. And I think the third fear check in the box would be the fact that it's easy to hide in the forest. you don't know what's watching you because there's trees everywhere. You have animals, predators potentially, or even predatory humans that could be hiding at every turn. Hollywood has picked up on that and made bunches of movies of, the whole cabin in the woods trope where somebody's isolated and scared in the woods because it works. It's something that we are afraid of. And so today's story starts off a lot like all the other kind of cliche cabin in the woods scary stories, but this one, it's different. This one scared the heck out of me because as I read the account of what happened in this cabin in the woods, I imagined myself being in this guy's position and thinking about the psychological trauma that this would have on you. And I've actually had a literal cabin in the woods scary experience, and you can check it out. It's one of my top videos on my YouTube channel. It's What I Saw in My Room Still Haunts Me. You can check it out. It's my own cabin in the woods story. But having been through something like that, I was able to put myself in this guy's position, and this story terrifies me. So as you're listening to today's story, try to put yourself in this guy's position and think to yourself, what would you have done? But before we get into today's story, if this type of content appeals to you, the kind of strange, dark, and mysterious that I'm going to deliver to you in a story format, if that's kind of your thing, I would ask you to please gently obliterate the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of these strange, dark, and mysterious uploads that I do every week. All right, let's get into today's story. In 2010, a 17-year-old boy is devastated to find out that his father had suddenly passed away. And it really sent shockwaves through the whole family. Not only because now they're grieving the loss of their father, their husband, but because so much of their daily lives they spent together. I mean, this was a very close family, and one of the things that they liked to do as a family was they owned a cabin. It was around Mount Bachelor in Oregon, this beautiful mountain where you can go snowboarding and skiing. They had this family cabin up there where in the wintertime, this family would spend a lot of time there. They would go up there as a family, spend time there as a family. It was this wonderful retreat. And as they're trying to settle the estate of their husband, their father, they're trying to figure out what they want to do with this cabin, because all of a sudden this place that, used to bring them so much joy and was a place of very fond memories suddenly felt kind of hollow. It just would never be the same. And so they decided that they were actually going to sell this cabin. And the 17-year-old boy was just really upset about this. He was very close with his father. He had some very fond memories of going hunting and skiing and snowboarding with his dad at this cabin. And so once the cabin was actually put up for sale by this boy's mother, he asked if, before they actually sell it, could he spend some time up there, I guess paying his respects in a way to his father. But he just wanted one more opportunity to spend some time in that cabin. And his mom said, go for it, take as many days as you want, go up and hang out in the cabin. But when you come back, we are going to sell the place. So his father had actually willed to his son his vehicle. And so the 17-year-old boy loads up his father's car. He goes out and he buys some snacks and drinks, heads up to the cabin in Oregon with the family dog whose name was Midnight. And his plan was just to go up to this cabin and basically try to enjoy being in this space one last time. Don't think about it as this place that now has no meaning because his father had died, but rather a place that he wanted one last positive memory before it was forever gone from their family. And so he gets up there, makes his way to the cabin, and he settles in for what turned out to be an abbreviated stay at the cabin. So in order to understand this story, we need to talk a little bit about the layout of the cabin itself. The cabin was 2 stories, and it was built into a mountain, Mount Bachelor in Oregon. And so the back half of the cabin was kind of settled into the mountain. So there were no windows, save a little sliver of window that fed into the bathroom, actually, in the back of the cabin. The front of the cabin was this beautiful, double-decker cabin with, windows on the second floor that fed into the master bedroom. On the second floor, there was a walk-out balcony that kind of jutted out a few feet from the second deck. The first floor, you could see in through all these beautiful windows. There was a sitting area, like a living room and a TV, and then a small kitchen as well. So the cabin was built in an area that was heavily forested. So they had to clear out, a bunch of trees to even build this cabin when the family had this built years and years ago. And so they really only cleared away the front section of trees so that there was a clear shot to the house, but the sides and the back were very heavily forested with these huge tall pine trees. And they basically had this little tiny driveway that fed in through all the trees, and you had this one kind of clearing in front of the cabin. So if you were on the second floor of the cabin, where there's the master bedroom, there's a bed up there, and you were looking out that window, you'd be looking over the balcony out into a clearing, basically. But there's a tree line, 100 yards past that clearing that's very dense. And there's actually a couple of trees, fairly prominent trees, that are sitting in front of the cabin that they did not cut down. One of which, for the story, we'll call it the sitting tree. Parallel to the ground, about 20 feet up, was this beautiful branch that looked perfect for a whole bunch of people sitting on it. But it was 20 feet above the ground, and there wasn't really any way to climb up to it, and no one was trying to climb this tree. But there's this tree that basically has a seat, if you will, like the branch is like a seat that is looking directly into the cabin. And that's going to matter later in the story. So clearing in front of the cabin with this one kind of sitting tree, and then a very dense forest 360 degrees beyond, that one clearing. So when the 17-year-old gets to the cabin, he goes inside, he puts his drinks in the fridge, puts his snacks on the counter, he hooks up his PlayStation to the TV, and he's just like having a great time. His dog Midnight is roaming around, enjoying being at the cabin, and he's having a great time. And over the course of the first 2 days that he was there, it was everything he hoped it would be. It was like he was bonding with his father one last time. It was a peaceful time that he was there. He was happy to be there. And he was just enjoying himself, eating snacks and playing video games for a couple of days. He actually left a couple times to go snowboarding too. But on the third day that he was there, things started to get pretty weird. So on the third day when he got up, it had snowed dramatically the night before. A couple of feet of snow on the ground, still snowing pretty heavily. And he's like, I just don't feel like brushing off my car and trying to go to the store or go to the slopes to go snowboarding. I'm just going to basically be shut in for the day. And he was excited about it. He's like, great, me and my dog Midnight can bomb around the inside and play some more video games and eat some more snacks and do whatever. Midday that day, Midnight needed to pee, so he went outside with Midnight and let Midnight run around and go to the bathroom. And while he's out there with his dog, he notices there are some footprints in the snow that looked relatively fresh. And this is the first time that he's left his cabin that day, so they aren't his. And his neighbors were pretty far away, and he figured that they were older, that they were probably not going to be trekking around the woods. So he's thinking to himself, I wonder who made these footprints. And he's looking at them, and they started in the woods. So the woods are not that far away from where he is. He's in a relatively small clearing just in front of his cabin. But he can tell these fresh footprints have come out of the woods. And they're basically right in front of this clearing. And he notices that they bank around and go to the back of his cabin and kind of go up onto the mountain. And he kind of just starts walking and following the footprints a bit, and they kind of disappear up onto the mountain behind his cabin. And he's not overly concerned or anything, but he definitely takes note that more than likely somebody was walking around his cabin. Maybe it was someone who got lost. Maybe it was a neighbor. I mean, he's rationalizing it. He's thinking, you know what? It can't have been anything too serious. Obviously, they didn't knock on my door. They didn't need anything. And so he kind of writes it off. So that night, he stays up late playing video games, and his dog is sleeping next to his chair. And at some point, he's tired and he wants to go to bed. So he draws all the curtains, so blackout curtains around the downstairs, shuts all the blinds, and locks all the windows, all the doors, and heads upstairs to the lofted second floor where the master bedroom is. He, gets in bed, turns off all the lights, everything's locked, everything's shut. The dog climbs into bed, and the dog would sleep up near his head. And suddenly the dog jumps up, still on the bed, and looks at the stairs leading downstairs to the front door. And its ears are perked up like it's heard something. And it wasn't unusual for the dog to be a little jumpy, maybe it heard something. He wasn't overtly concerned. But when Midnight, the dog, jumps off the bed and sprints downstairs after having this sudden alertness, and he's listening. Now he is a little bit worried. He's thinking, well, I saw footsteps yesterday walking around my cabin, and now it's the middle of the night and my dog is downstairs acting like it's heard something. And he hears the dog, Midnight, pacing around the downstairs, like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Every indication is the dog wants to go outside. That's the noises that he's picking up that signal from the dog. And so finally, even though he's feeling a little bit unnerved by this, he decides to go down and see what Midnight wants. And so Midnight is by the door, ears perked up, very eager to go outside. It's pacing, and he thinks, you know what, she just needs to go to the bathroom. And so he opens the door with Midnight and he goes outside and he expects his dog to pee. But Midnight doesn't need to pee. Midnight starts kind of stalking around the corner and looking out across the clearing towards the sitting tree in that direction, and it just stops. And it's looking at something very intently, as if it spotted an animal or something in the woods. And so the boy is looking at the dog and he's kind of trying to encourage the dog to do its business so they can go back in the cabin. And he's starting to feel really uncomfortable. He's looking around, he's thinking like, okay, I don't know what's going on, like I'm a little bit concerned now. And he's sensing that Midnight is going at some point to try to take off after whatever she sees in the woods. And so preemptively, he grabs Midnight and says, all right, drags Midnight back in the house and shuts the door and locks it and takes one last look out the window of the door and just kind of looks out. I mean, it's dark, he doesn't have a light or anything. And he's like, man, that's creepy. Locks it, shuts the blinds, confirms everything downstairs is locked, does a sanity check to make sure everything is locked. And he goes back upstairs with Midnight. Midnight did not want to go back upstairs. He had to practically drag her back upstairs. And then when they did get back in bed, Midnight refused to get in bed, but instead stood next to the bed looking at the stairs, wanting to go downstairs, periodically looking back at him and then down at the stairs. Midnight wanted to go back outside. So he's laying there in bed and he's taking full stock of the fact that his dog is very much on edge, but he's trying to fall back asleep, trying to convince himself that nothing weird is going on. And after about 30 minutes of that and being unsuccessful at falling asleep, as he's laying there, it's silent and all of a sudden he hears footsteps on his roof. Now the roof is right above his head. I mean, he's on the second floor. There is no attic. The roof is right there. And he hears about 6 footsteps. And he actually described it as something with hooves. And his dog instantly looks up as well. And they're both watching the ceiling as what sounds like hooves walking along the roof of this cabin. And it was so distinctive that immediately what he's thinking to himself is, how could a deer or a moose or something get on the roof of the house? There is no way, unless you leapt from a tree or had a ladder, for you to get on the roof. And how did we not hear, if they leapt from a tree or a ladder even, how didn't we hear a loud slamming sound when they first landed on the roof? Like it's as if they've been there for a while and we just didn't know. And so then the footsteps stop, and at this point the dog stops looking at the roof and goes right to the balcony, which is shut. There's a door shut to the balcony and there's curtains drawn against the balcony, so he can't see what's out there. And so the 17-year-old boy is sitting in his bed and he's like, oh, I don't want to see what's on the porch. And he even says in his write-up about this that he's like, I'm a pretty tough guy, but I am in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night, totally isolated. Like, I almost don't want to know what's going on outside. I just want to pretend it's not happening. But at some point, he musters the courage to go out on the balcony. And so he walks over very timidly to the door, and Midnight's there ready to go outside. And he takes a deep breath and he slides open the blackout curtains. But there's no light outside and there's no light inside, so it's just kind of darkness. And he can barely make out even just the snow that's on the balcony right in front of him. And he takes a deep breath and he unlocks the door and he opens it up. And the first thing he does is he turns and he looks up at the roof to see if there's a deer or a moose or something on the roof. There's nothing up there, and he's kind of peering around and he can't even see footprints up there. So in a way, he's kind of relieved, right? Like, I must have been imagining that. He had a flashlight, and so at this point, he's looking back at his roof of his cabin, and he shines the light real quick, and it's totally dark out, right? So this light goes very far, and he sees nothing. And the dog at this point, he can hear the dog making kind of some commotion below him. It's angling itself to look out in the direction of the sitting tree and out towards that tree line where the dog had originally been fixated on something in the tree line. And so just doing his diligence, the 17-year-old scans from the top of the roof where he sees nothing. He starts scanning over to the side of the house, right? Like this is the direction of the sitting tree. He's looking over here and he's scanning the tree line, just looking for anything that might have been on the roof. And he's looking and he's looking and he's looking, and then he gets to the sitting tree. And his flashlight stops on a man crouched on that perch 20 feet off the ground on the sitting tree, who looked very tall. He had his hands holding onto the branch right above him and his mouth is open. And he's holding onto the branch and he's looking directly at the boy. unblinking, 100% focused on him. He's less than 50 yards away from him at this point. And it took him a second, the 17-year-old, to register what his flashlight was pointed at. And he panics and he drops it. And the dog reacts to the drop flashlight too. And because he's alone out here, he needs to protect himself, so he scoops that light back up and he shines it one more time to see, like, holy cow, like, what did I just see? And the guy on the branch is now gone. And he scans the ground. There's nothing. And he's terrified at this point, so he grabs his dog, throws Midnight back into the cabin, runs back in, shuts the door, locks it, closes the blinds, turns off his light, and literally gets back in bed with his dog, and he's now basically cowering on the bed. So at this point, they're sitting on the bed. Midnight is no longer acting like she wants to go outside. I think she's picking up potentially on the paranoia. Okay. At this point, the boy and his dog are sitting on the bed, and they're both scared at this point. Midnight, was fearsome while she was outside, but now that she's back inside, she doesn't want to go near the door either. She's rubbing up against him. She doesn't want to go anywhere. And they're sitting there, and the boy, all he's thinking to himself is, did I really just see that? It looked like an unnaturally tall man. How did he get in the tree? That's 20 feet off the ground. There's no way to get up into the tree. And why was it sitting there with its mouth open, staring at me? And who was on the roof? Was anything on the roof? And if this thing can get 20 feet up into a tree, it certainly can get on the roof of my cabin, I would imagine. But what was it? So he's having this type of thought process, and he's realizing too that it's not that late in the night. He still has hours until the sun's going to come up. And as he's basically panicking and feeding off his own paranoia, and it's getting worse and worse by the second, he hears tapping on the door, on the front door of his cabin. And his heart sinks, and he and his dog kind of look in the direction of the tapping, and he knows he's not going to go open the door. He knows the door is locked. He knows everything is locked. He's panicking that maybe it wasn't, but he knows he locked it. And the tapping just sounds like a finger tapping on the window. And at some point the tapping stops, and he thinks, okay, maybe they'll just go away. And then he hears what sounds like footsteps outside, and then tapping begins on the side of his cabin. Not the front door anymore, like the wall of the cabin. Now it's a little bit louder. The tapping continues up the side of the house, and then it stops. And he's sitting there and he's thinking, whatever this is walking around my cabin. And then he hears tapping on the little slit that is the window that feeds into the bathroom that's right behind the bedroom that he's in right now. So 6 feet away, maybe 10 feet away, whatever this thing is now literally just a small pane of glass away, tapping on the glass. And so now he's petrified. And he's just hoping that this thing goes away. It doesn't. It goes to the other side of the cabin and starts tapping on the wall on the other side of the cabin, and makes it all the way back to the front, where it begins tapping on the glass of the front window, back to the door. And he's just thinking, like, whatever this is walking around my cabin, tapping all over my cabin. And then all the tapping stops. And his heart's racing. It's the middle of the night. He's in the middle of the woods somewhere. He's totally isolated. And then it's like his worst nightmare comes true. He hears footsteps on his balcony, and then tapping right on the big sliding glass doors of the door leading out to the balcony. And he knows that right behind a blackout curtain and a pane of glass is this tall man, more than likely, who's right on his balcony. And the tapping on the balcony goes on and on and on. And then all of a sudden it stops. And he's just waiting for it to open the door and come inside. But it doesn't. Instead, it goes on the roof, and it starts tapping on the roof directly above him. And the tapping continues all night. And so finally the sun comes up. He hasn't slept all night, and he finally gets the courage to go over to the balcony and open up the curtains and see what's out there. And when he does, there is nothing out there, but there's footprints, as if someone had been pacing on the balcony all night. He opens it up and he finally just jumps out and looks up on his roof. There's nothing on his roof. He can see all these footprints on his roof. He looks down, and it's like a racetrack of footprints all around his house. Someone had been basically stalking his house all night, and then the footsteps retreat all the way to the sitting tree and then go back into the woods. He packed up his stuff, he left, and he couldn't have been happier that the family sold that cabin, because he was never going to go back. So to this day, he has no idea what it was. And even if it was just a person who was tapping on your windows and your walls and your roof and your balcony, even if it was just a human being doing that, that would be horrifying. Let alone if it was something else, something paranormal. And so if you want to check out my video about my experience, it's on my channel called What I Saw in My Room Still Haunts Me. It's eerily similar to the one that I just described of the 17-year-old in Oregon. And so I'd love to hear in the comments what you think was doing all that tapping. And if it's possible, if that was just some person screwing with this poor kid, or maybe it was something else. So let me know in the comments, and I'll try to get back to as many people as I possibly can. If you haven't already, please, if you like this story, gently obliterate the like button and subscribe and turn on all post notifications so you can get 3 to 4 videos just like this every week. If you want to get in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also quite active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen over there, and I go live on there all the time, 10 o'clock Eastern, most days of the week. So I hope to see you in one of those other places, and I hope you'll continue to watch my videos here on YouTube. And that's going to do it, guys. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. In the early 2000s, a teenager named Eben and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eben turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eben and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals. Silence. It's just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally make it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They get all settled in, they're getting ready to see some animals. And all day long, they don't see a single animal. They don't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it is just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand, and they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, you know, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which is perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eben's father says, hey, you know, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? Eben's like, yeah, why not? So they hike a little ways away from their campsite and they set up their blind, and once again, they don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. And so they turn around and they start heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eben's father turns to him and says, oh, it must have been the wind. And Eben says, no, it couldn't have been the wind, because all day today we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind. So Eben's father is like, well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly? And Eben's like, no, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. They walk into their campsite and they look down at their tent, and they're really confused at what they see. The 2 rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, well, they had been removed from the 4 corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points, or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decide, you know what, it can't be some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that if they came to our campsite? Why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they build their tent and they make a little fire and they stay up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguish the fire, they get in the tent, and they both fall asleep. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not, but he thinks he hears someone laughing a couple 100 meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is. And then Eben starts listening really intently to what's happening outside. And all he can hear is silence, like it's been since they got in the woods. He doesn't hear any more laughter, and so he says, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there, and eventually Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sits up and goes, what's going on? And his dad goes, shh. And he goes, can you hear that? And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction, and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and carefully explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier, and Eben's father turns to Eben and says, before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening because they're hoping this is just going to stop and whatever this is just going to leave. But it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest. And it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them. And then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben is now grabbing onto his father. Eben's father is holding onto his rifle and he's getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever is out there. And right before he grabs the zipper, this person, whatever it is, starts laughing again. And it's practically right on top of them. It's so loud. They can hear it clear as day right there, right outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper, and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. They don't hear footsteps, so they know probably something's still out there. But the laughter stops like it's recognized that they're making noise. They're right there. There they are. They're in the tent. Eben's father freezes with his hand on this zipper, and he's debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he can even make that decision, whatever this thing is turns around and runs back into the woods, and it's just gone. And for several minutes, they just sit like that in total silence, praying that whatever this is gone for good. And after several minutes, when they don't hear anything, there's no more laughing, there's no more running, Eben's father re-zips up the tent, puts his hand back down, and they're both left just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Eben and his father would stay up all night, and they would barely speak, because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it's so quiet, sound travels really far, and they don't know who or what is out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they're just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it. And the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's video, please tell us in the comments section and tell us where you found it. So what's the timestamp? And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, at the next solar eclipse, please give the like button a pair of cardboard flimsy children's 3D glasses and tell them with these on, you can look directly at the solar eclipse and be totally safe. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It is linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.